I don't think anybody is proposing that we ignore that it happened. I don't think that's accurate.
I think that the problem is that there are people, and Scott used the term a couple of times, and I don't think it was meant with any type of ill intent, but he said, you know, we got over it. And I think that's the problem. I think that there are a lot of people in this country.
That single sentence completely changed the direction of this CNN debate. What started as a discussion about Donald Trump criticizing how slavery is presented in museums suddenly became something much deeper, a fight over whether America has actually moved on from slavery at all. Because one side of the panel argues that America overcame its darkest chapter and should focus more on progress, success, and patriotism. But the other side says that mindset itself is exactly the problem because millions of Americans are still living with the consequences of slavery, segregation, and discrimination today. And once those personal stories start coming out, the conversation becomes impossible to ignore. One panelist even reveals his own parents lived through school desegregation and racial violence, completely shifting the emotional weight of the discussion. This debate goes from political to deeply personal very fast.
I was actually surprised to see President Trump basically saying the quiet part out loud, that this review of the Smithsonian is not about even just something vague about reviewing history to make sure that it's fair. He wants to make it so that it talks less about slavery. What does that say to you?
Well, I think it's an effort. It's part of a larger effort to both sanewash and whitewash American history and essentially erase all of the parts and disappear all of the parts that make Americans, that make President Trump uncomfortable, that feel distasteful, that are a reflection of the actual real and horrific parts of our history. And I find it a little ironic. You know, earlier today, as I was listening to some of the commentary, my first thought was, wait a second, I wonder if the president has actually ever visited any of the Smithsonian museums. And then I remembered that in 2017, he actually took a tour of the National Museum of African American History and Culture.
Let me just play actually what he said during that tour. Listen to this.
I had the privilege of visiting the National Museum of African American History and Culture right here in Washington, D.C. It's a new, beautiful Smithsonian museum that serves as a shining example of African Americans' incredible contributions to our culture, our society, and our history. It also tells of the great struggle for freedom and equality that prevailed against the sins of slavery and the injustice of discrimination. The work and love of the people who helped create such a masterpiece is a testament to the legacy of so many leaders it honors.
So was it that he didn't believe what he read from the teleprompter as he recorded that video, or what?
You know, I'm really struggling to understand in a lot of ways, particularly given that the tour that he took with director Lonnie Bunch was actually a reflection of really the mastery that and really the care and the patience that historians, that scholars, that curators put into the Museum of African American History and Culture. It is not just about the horrors of slavery, although it tells that very important story. It actually follows this really brilliant model where you move through the museum and it tells the story not just of enslaved Americans in America, but also of the resilience, of the triumph. And in doing so, it tells a story that is very much about democracy and about a quest for democracy and the way that Americans both built this country, but also the story and the narrative of like a truly American experience. And so for the president, I think, to just simply erase that and push that away tells it, particularly after praising it a few years ago, tells us that this is part of a much larger agenda. This is part of a much larger agenda to erase things that really, I think the country is just refuses to deal with and is really uncomfortable with.
He said as much by ending this post with, "This country cannot be woke because woke is broke." He says, "We have to have the hottest country in the world and we want people to talk about it, including our museums." Why is he equating talking about slavery with woke?
Well, look, I think, let me just start this conversation by saying that my personal view is slavery was a reprehensible institution. I agree with your words that it was our original sin. we also fought a war to eradicate it and to get over it as a country. And that was a necessary thing that happened, and a lot of people died, and we did eradicate it, and that's a good thing. I think what he's asking is, in our museums, what defines us? Are we going to be defined by the worst moment?
This is the core argument Trump supporters have been making for years during these culture war debates. The idea is simple. Yes, slavery was horrific. Yes, it was evil, but America eventually abolished it, fought a civil war over it, and then became one of the most successful nations in modern history. So in their view, constantly centering slavery in museums and education creates a version of America that focuses more on guilt than achievement. And honestly, that argument connects with a lot of conservatives because they believe modern institutions increasingly present America as fundamentally oppressive instead of exceptional. That's why phrases like anti-American or woke ideology keep appearing in these discussions. But the problem is that the other side hears something very different. When people say focus less on slavery, critics interpret that as minimizing the suffering that literally built major parts of the country's economy and institutions. And that's why this debate instantly becomes emotional. Because slavery isn't just seen as a bad moment in history, many historians argue it shaped the legal system, banking system, labor system, and racial hierarchy that America still deals with today. So both sides walk into this debate believing they are protecting America, but they completely disagree on what protecting America actually means.
Or the worst institution, or the worst mistake we ever made? Or are we going to be defined by what we've done moving forward to get over it and to become the greatest nation on the earth? My belief is that he wants to look at these museums, not because he wants to do away with the idea that slavery occurred, but that he wants to ask a very simple question. Are we going to present ourselves as being exceptional or not? And I think he believes there is an effort by some to continue to try to define us from our worst moment instead of try to focus and define us based on our best moments, which started when we eradicated slavery and began to move forward as the light of the world. And
but
so
isn't
that's
that
what I
make
think.
Museums, that's what makes us an exceptional nation, is because they tell the history and the story of our country, and therefore, you know, these horrible, horrific moments in our history, the original sin, as Abby talked about, when it comes to slavery, has, you know, we of course did eradicate it, but look where we've come today. And I think those museums, like to your point, make America exceptional. And in museums all around the world that document atrocities, whether it be, you know, from Nazi Germany to eradicating slavery here in the United States, you have to learn the lessons of the past. And to deny it is to defend it.
I don't think he's denying it. And Bachi may want to comment on this as well. But I think what he wants to ask is a simple question. As we present our history, are we spending most of our time focused on something terrible? Are we going to spend more time as we enter our 250th anniversary focused on what this country has done to improve the lives of every single person who lives here? We are the light of the world for a reason, because we're an improving commodity.
The question I ask when I hear you say that is, why? I mean, the idea that slavery happened, it's hard to understand what we've overcome if you don't even talk about what it was. You know, I think that kind of waters down the whole.
I don't think anybody is proposing that we ignore that it happened. I don't think that's accurate.
I think that the problem is that there are people, and Scott used the term a couple of times, and I don't think it was meant with any type of ill intent, but he said, you know, we got over it. And I think that's the problem. I think that there are a lot of people in this country.
And this is the moment where the debate completely shifts from politics to lived experience. Because the panelist responding here isn't talking about slavery as some distant event from hundreds of years ago, he starts explaining how his own parents experienced segregation, how his father was involved in the Orangeburg Massacre era, and how many Black Americans today are still the first generation in their families to gain access to opportunities that others had decades earlier. That's why the phrase "we got over it" triggered such a strong reaction. To many Americans, especially Black Americans, slavery doesn't feel disconnected from the present. The effects carried into segregation, housing discrimination, unequal education systems, voting restrictions, policing, and generational wealth gaps. So when someone says America already moved past it, critics hear that as dismissing everything that happened afterward, too. And that's what makes this conversation so difficult politically. One side sees modern discussions about race as necessary truth-telling. The other side sees them as endless national self-hatred that keeps reopening old wounds. But what really made this CNN segment powerful was how personal it became. Once the panelist started talking about his own family's experiences, the debate stopped sounding like an abstract political argument and started sounding like a reminder that this history is still incredibly recent for a lot of people living in America today.
Who believe that for some reason we got over it. I mean, the fact is that American chattel slavery is vastly different than what Jillian Michaels and others talk about when they talk about slavery around the world. I mean, the chattel slavery system that we had was extremely transactional. It was actually codified in law, and it was based upon the color and race, as you so eloquently pointed out in your opening. And so not only when you think about that portion of where we are, 26 of our first 30 Supreme Court justices own slaves. The people who are on our money every single day own slaves. United States presidents, members of the United States Congress own slaves. Lehman Brothers, we're not far from Wall Street, own slaves. Brooks Brothers suits that we wear own slaves. So not only are we talking about the epicenter and the foundation of where our country was built, we have to acknowledge that. But even more importantly, and this is where I believe that Scott and I can find agreement on this issue. Breon and Megan Walker, two of my best friends in the world, their dad was the first African-American SGA president at the University of South Carolina, right? He was an exec at IBM, but he was one of the first, right? We're still talking about first that emerged and stood on those shoulders. I tell the story often about my mom and dad. My mom helped desegregate high schools. In Hamilton High School in Memphis, Tennessee, my dad shot in the Orangeburg Massacre. This is a part of my story. This isn't some faint, distant history. Yeah. And so the reason I bring that up is because I think that American exceptionalism talks about the fact that Black folk enslaved folk help build this country for what it is. Mm-hmm. They built Washington, D.C. Mm-hmm. But all of us are around this table. Abby, myself, all of us, not just Abby and myself, all of us are around this table because of the sacrifices and the blood and the sweat and the tears these people poured in.